It's not an accident that man's earliest attempts at measurement consisted of relating things to himself, as for instance, taking the length of the foot as a standard, which has its origin in man's 10 fingers. And then talks about man being the measure of all things epistemologically, not metaphysically. So that distinction I was curious about. And then in regard to human knowledge, man has to be the measure, since he has to bring all things into the realm of the humanly knowable. And then this goes back to this Nietzsche's essay of treat man as the measure of all things. But in doing so, he proceeds from the error of believing that he has these things which he intends to measure immediately before him as mere objects. He forgets that the original perceptual metaphors are metaphors and takes them to be things in themselves. And right before that, he talks about the universe in connection with man. The universe is the infinitely fractured echo of one original sound man. The entire universe is the infinitely multiplied copy of one original picture man. So all knowledge in relation to ourselves. So that's I guess that was just pointing out that's another similarity I was thinking about.
Yeah, it's a very close similarity. I mean, the difference clearly that Rand thinks that these can be objective. You can use this to create an objective definition of concepts and things like that. But Nietzsche's saying because it's a measure, then well, they really are just metaphors, and we can't take it as truth.
Yeah.
But besides that, it's quite similar. Like, man is the measure of all things. They both agree on that.
But then, what about this distinction between the measure being epistemological versus metaphysical? Man as a metaphysical measure, what would that mean? Man as the origin of all things with no rules? Because that would be Nietzsche then, wouldn't it?
Somewhat. So, man is the measure, epistemologically speaking. So, I mean, Nietzsche's acknowledging that like man is the one measuring these things. It's not the concepts are not metaphysical. The essential isn't metaphysical in the way like metaphysical being like the object in itself.
Yeah. Okay. Right.
That would be metaphysical, where they both kind of agree it's epistemological. But Nietzsche thinks that by being epistemological, they're really just metaphors.
Okay. And what about Protagoras then? What did he mean when he said man is the measure of all things and it was a metaphysical statement? And how did that differ from Nietzsche?
It was probably primacy of consciousness that I'm not positive.
Right.
But if there's another meaning, it's like, what would it mean to man is the measure of all things metaphysically speaking? I guess that would almost be like primacy of consciousness, that reality comes out of our imagination, or reality comes out of concepts or something. Like the opposite, we would think.
And Nietzsche didn't think that? Because it's
not that reality is created by our will, but that our understanding of reality is always created. I'm not sure what he thought of exactly, but it's not like he denied that there's any reality out there, just that more like any understanding of it is completely subjective. It's up to our perspective. Like his view is often called perspectivism, that all knowledge and understanding is all relative to your perspective.
Okay.
And that's Nietzsche's view, characterized in one word: perspectivism. It's all about your perspective.
Okay. Yeah, maybe we can get into more Nietzsche later. All right. Next thing is I was trying to clarify, just as an exercise, and because I use the concept a lot, relationship. And I got it down to something like it's actually quite difficult with some of those abstract concepts to try and identify them in terms of genus and differentia, but we are managing to use them, but we're not necessarily able to identify the essence. I got it down to something like a relationship it just refers to a cause and effect relationship between two or more entities that is identified, something like that.
Yeah, that's what I would say.
Oh, wait, I used relationship in the definition.
We can fix it. Let's just, hey, the causal something of between two. The
But
causal
that's what a relationship is.
impact.
The
The
cause
causal.
the causes and effects of two or more entities on each other, something like that.
Yeah, the cause and effect of entities upon each other.
And when you go through a process like this, even if you're not 100% right, how have you done anything like this where you've gone through, like, I don't know, 40 or 50 key concepts? And have you found it's had any, if you
No,
have?
my method is you just think of the word and some words and just put them together as they go, depending on my subject. I might take a few words as I'm reading and then like close my eyes and think about it and then organize it from there. But I don't usually go over my concepts unless I'm trying to explain it to someone or clarify to myself what I'm thinking about. So I guess when I'm trying to clarify it specifically, I might take a few similar words and then think about them together, or a few related words and just think about them until I can see a relationship or a way of thinking about them.
So usually your approach is it's not necessarily to attempt to clarify one concept in an isolated manner, but as you're reading or studying something, you just look at it in the context that it's in, and then
that's the best way for me to do it. Like, I take a few terms and see how the big picture of what I'm reading, and I go from there. Like, usually I could understand Nietzsche sometimes. Like, he's very difficult to understand sometimes, but usually I just take one core idea and just reflect on a few terms within that essay and see how they work together.
Right.
I don't worry so much about the details as much as what did the contest mention and what was his point. Yeah. I'm not getting into detail, like maybe I'm misunderstanding some sentences or I might not get it, but to understand the concepts, I need to understand more than one together. I can't do them in isolation.
Yeah. That's true. Okay, maybe I'm trying to find something else I wanted to show you, and if I can't find it, I will just go to the next.
I wanted to mention about some of those words though, like when we were trying to talk about proof. I was reading some essay about epistemological terms in English and how this person thinks they're really confusing. In English, they're not as good as other languages. Like proof, there's two senses of the word proof, which is like what you were saying. Like one is like the noun, one's like the process.
Right.
Like when you say a rum is proof or something, like that's referring to the end process of the whole thing, not referring to each step, but then there is proof as in the process. And it's hard to make that distinction in English. In German, it's not so bad. And then even to know, there's most languages have two forms of to know, like Spanish, Latin, French. They all have two verbs that mean to know. Like one is like to know, like about the world, or to know a fact. Like there's different senses of knowing, even just in the words in English, doesn't really have those distinctions. So sometimes even if you're trying to do concepts in English, you might realize that, oh, this in English, maybe it's not helping me. Like maybe I could just use a compound word or two terms in English, or in some instances, you might just use a different language for your concept.
Yeah, I've been looking at when I am trying to clarify, I'm doing them individually, but I'm doing it open to the possibility that it won't be helpful. And so I'm just assessing as I go and seeing and trying to see if going through that process is useful when I'm reading other texts. And I'm obviously just attempting to clarify key terms that pop up in a lot of different texts and then seeing what impact it has on me.
Yeah.
But the etymology has been helpful because I've been able to see the word could be related to something else. It could be a different word, you know, it's from Latin or Germanic. And then when you do that, it helps. Because like you said, there could be multiple meanings or there could be multiple words for one concept. And the other thing is that I think that the process is probably personal in the sense that my knowledge, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a philosopher. And so it would make sense that my knowledge would not be as precise as theirs on a lot of concepts. And so I'm going to be, the way I'm clarifying a concept will be simpler and will be the equivalent of that, more closer to the child seeing, you know, defining man according to this shape, this big shape that moves. And so in that case, there may also be different words that I use in my definition. It may have different connections to other words because it's not a sign, it's for my own understanding and clarification.
I think that's a good approach.
Okay, I found this dialogue. So this is Fat, you know, Fat Tony.
Yeah, you change the screen. I think it's still
Sorry?
the text.
Yeah. I'm gonna paste it into this window. I've just found. Yeah.
Fat Tony.
Yeah. So this is a conversation that Fat Tony got into with Socrates, except now Fat Tony, according to Nassim Taleb, I wanted to analyze with you. According to Nassim, so Nassim Taleb turned this. Fat Tony turned on Socrates, and he's making fun of Socrates. He's like, "Tell me, old man, does a child need to define a mother's milk to understand the need of milk? To understand the need to drink it?" That's a typo. No, he does not. And my dear Socrates, does a dog need to define what an owner is to be loyal to him? A dog has, so he's kind of, and then he says, I agree, my dear Socrates, that a dog has instinct and we are not dogs. But are we humans so fundamentally different as to be completely stripped of instinct, leading us to do things we have no clue about? Do we have to limit life to what we can answer in Proto-Brooklyn English? Then, my good Socrates, why do you think that we need to fix the meaning of things? My dear Mega Tony, we need to know what we will analyze it after this. We need to know what we are talking about when we talk about things. The entire idea of philosophy is to be able to reflect and understand on what we are doing. Examine our lives. An unexamined life is not worth living. The problem, my dear Socrates, is that you're killing the things we can know, but not express. And if I ask someone riding a bicycle just fine to give me the theory behind his bicycle riding, he would fall from it. By bullying and questions people, you confuse them and hurt them. My dear Socrates, you know why we are putting you to death? It is because you make people feel stupid for blindly following habits, instincts, and traditions. You may be occasionally right, but you may confuse them about things that they're doing just fine without getting into trouble. You are destroying people's illusions about themselves. You are taking the joy of ignorance out of the things we don't understand, and you have no answer. You have no answer to offer them. Okay, so I mean, I have a few thoughts on this, and then I'd be keen to hear yours. So I'll just highlight the relevant passages that I think are important.
That was a big sense, that first one. I don't think it was a typo. It's a step. You have to understand mother's milk to understand the need of milk. Do you need to understand the need of milk to understand the need to drink it?
Right. Need to define that to understand the need of milk to understand the need to drink it. Right. Okay. Well, it's still relevant there. So I've that one
going to their
and instincts. Yeah, that's probably relevant.
Yeah.
Okay, and then I guess this is related to. We'll just leave these two. All right. So when I read this, I was like, this is a really interesting that he's trying to take a different view, and he is right in that there are some things that there are concepts we use that we would really struggle to define, but we use them just fine. For example, milk. He gave the example milk, and it is interesting because milk is it's a lower level abstraction. So it's, you can point to milk, it exists out there, whereas something like piety doesn't exist out there. It's a way higher level abstraction, dependent on many previous abstractions. And so that's the first thing that came to mind, is that the only example he's given is of milk, which is a lower level abstraction. And then he talks about a dog, which is interesting. A dog having loyalty. And so the dog, he says, there's some kind of switch happening here. Like the first switch is that the definitions are relevant for, let's just start with that. What do you think of that? Like, it seems like this is, if he gave an example of an abstract concept we use that we can't define, that is way higher level than milk, like for example, justice or risk, then maybe that I would go, okay, that's interesting. But I guess because he's using milk, I wonder if this is more of there's some kind of switch or mistake here. What do you think?
I think he's referring to ostensive things that you don't really define, you just point to. Yeah. I don't know if you could really, you can create a definition, but I don't think the definition is necessary. And Socrates agrees there too.
Yeah.
You does not need to do that to understand it. So yeah, I agree with it so far. Fat Tony's reasoning.
Right. Okay.
Then
does a dog need to define what an owner is to be loyal to him?
So not in the same way. They don't need to.
Right. I agree with that. He does not examine his life. We are not dogs. I agree, Socrates, that the dog has...
I would pause on instinct, though. Like, a dog has instinct. Well, I mean, going by Socrates, we want to know what that even means. I mean, I guess that's a standard question. Do we need to even define what instinct is? But anyway, as far as talking about instinct, we can just refer to it as
innate automated behavior.
Yeah, but I do think there's some amount of cognition to it. So
yeah,
instinct. Well, let's just say non-cognitive, just so we can keep going with this. A dog has non-cognitive thinking. Yeah, it just goes on feeling. It doesn't reflect. It doesn't reason. So Fat Tony agrees.
But are we humans so fundamentally different so as to be completely stripped of instinct, leading us to do things we have no clue about? Do we have to limit life to what we can answer in Proto-Brooklyn English? So I guess he's making a case for Fat Tony is making a case for us also being able to utilize this thing called the instinct to make effective decisions.
And whatever that instinct might be. So we're assuming it's not like a precise, like definition by psychologists, just that a dog way of thinking, the dog way of being.
We could probably just go with a feeling.
The dog way of being.
The dog way of being. Okay.
But if we're animals, why would we be stripped of that kind of thing?
Right, exactly, because we're also animals, so we should have this thing called instinct.
Yes.
So why? And then he's like, well, and then, okay, so on that basis that we are also like animals, we are animals, we also have feelings or emotions, then why do we need to fix the meaning of anything? That's where we go from. Which doesn't that bring it back to like making that distinction between the first level, the ostensive definitions and first level abstractions and higher level ones?
Yeah, that's the consideration here. I mean, that's what we're really thinking about. Do we need those higher abstractions, or do we need to define anything if we don't? I mean, can't we operate like a dog if dogs can function that way?
Right.
Like, why do we need to fix the meaning of things? Why not just go off of this instinct or intuition?
Yeah.
Or this is what Nietzsche's, let's think of in terms of what Nietzsche was saying. Don't go by this reason, go by intuition, the feeling, the passion of it.
Yeah.
Why not do that? So Socrates says, we need to know what we are talking about when we talk about things. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I mean,
Yeah.
you're examining what they are. You're examining what impact they have.
Right.
I mean, it's simple enough of a
And then
response.
Fat Tony is now saying, he's saying the issue with Socrates' approach of wanting to define, well, he claims, I guess, that Socrates wants to, well, he's not claiming Socrates wants to define everything, but he seems to be using the example of milk to use that it's not necessary to define everything. And then he says that in trying to define everything, we're killing the things we can know but not express. Like if you ask someone to ride a bicycle just fine, who someone riding a bicycle just fine to give me a theory behind his bicycle riding, he would fall from it, which I don't think that's the same thing as if someone's like taking their dad to court, let's say, for being because it's pious to take his dad to court for murder, that he's not riding a bicycle. He can be questioned before he commits it, right? I guess this is a kind of switch that he's doing as well, right? Like that's not the same thing to ask someone if
some kind of switch. Like what I see here is that Fat Tony in this case is that it may be true that we need to know what we're talking about things. It may be true we need to know what we are talking about when we talk about these things, but sometimes by talking about it, it just confuses people.
Yeah.
That the more we question, the more frustrated they get because they can't quite figure out what they're getting wrong. They don't quite get it. They don't.
Right.
In a way that when you're thinking about it, it makes it worse off because you fell from the bike, and maybe even in court will fail in the same way. That we can't actually define our ethics. It really just originates on some feeling or instinct or whatever it is.
Right. And he's killing the things we can know but not express because those things exist. But then how do you, the question is, of course, how you make that distinction.
Yeah. And I do think, at least in this case, Fat Tony is going too far with the reasoning. I mean, what you can conclude, certainly, is that we do have a nature. There is partly an animal nature to it because we're part animal. So there's no reason to suppose we lose it completely if we're part animal. But it doesn't actually disprove anything about the value of reasoning. I think the distinction that you probably notice is like versus the ostensive versus the more abstract. That maybe the ostensive things we shouldn't try to define so rigidly. That Socrates asking you repeatedly, what is existence, isn't all you can do is say it's all this. And I was like, well, what does it mean? It's like, well, you can put words to it. It is that basic level. You can't put words to it. And that would destroy your cognition. Like it would introduce endless skepticism because you can't define it. So you can't define it in an abstract way. So then you're questioning everything. After that, what is existence? Do I exist? Can anything exist? And you lose that bottom. You lose that foundation.
Because you're trying to, so a definition is a statement in terms of concepts, but some, like concepts already assume there are certain things you're looking at or using, like you're pointing at a milk bottle or something like that. And you can't use necessarily, like if you see milk, you can't necessarily use a rock. You can't use another concept to define rock. It doesn't, it's okay. You're reversing the order, the hierarchy of knowledge.
And that's what you could respond to Fat Tony with. Instead of just saying, oh, you're right, there's just instinct, that's all there is. You could go with that. Like, well, you're partly right. Because the intuitive things like knowing how to ride a bike, can you define that in terms like even forgetting individual concepts, just let's take knowing how to ride a bike. Right. Can you put that into words? I don't think so.
Yeah.
In a way, I think that is ostensive like other things. One has to do with motion and motor movements and all those things.
Yeah.
I don't think you could put those into words. All you can do is say is this. This is riding a bike. take from it what you will, but I can't put it in words, but this is what it is, doing this.
Right. But then this is being used to justify like making decisions on the basis of much more abstract concepts of like risk or something like that. And then claiming that is right, like riding a bicycle.
Yeah, that too, because it is clearly different than riding a bike, because it's not just this action you're doing. I mean, there is thought involved in even the process of doing it. To analyze risk, that is thinking. It's not like you're talking about like the way you run, the way you skydive or something like that.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I just thought it was cool. I like he's kind of he's very unconventional and strange, and so I went over this and I thought it was interesting. Yeah, go on. Sorry.
There was an interesting study I read about what it means to what's the content of a concept. This was a psychology paper. So take one idea that, if you're holding a pencil and you're writing with it and all that, then somebody comes along and asks you where they last left their pencils, or they might ask you, where did pencils come from and how are they made? You can't really think about both at the same time. You can't both be writing and not even thinking about just using your pencil and talking about where it came from, because it interferes with your thinking that there's too much information going on about pencils. And even just the action of doing it interferes. Even if you're not thinking about it, using the pencil, then somebody asks you about it, it's more difficult than otherwise. And it's almost like he's saying about riding the bike there. If you're riding a bike, then explain it. You're probably going to fall down as you're explaining it. Yeah. Because understanding to ride a bike is partly encoded as or represented as the motions themselves. To like the doing is part of the understanding.
Right.
And then the experiment was examining this with different concepts and using the item at the same time and doing brain scans at the same time. And they did notice a difference, like the way the brains were reacting to the situation, that the way that information is being processed. There's a lot more detail to it, but the idea being there's more evidence for the idea that understanding is also represented as the doing of the action, even if it's just a tool. Say, understanding what a pencil is involves using it, not just defining it in words.
Okay, this goes back to a couple of conversations we had. So one is Mary's room, the other one is which you didn't get into. So Mary's room, and then you also when we talked about the nature of evil, and you said full understanding includes
the doing.
The doing, and I was confused because I thought you could fully understand something and not be able to do it. And so it goes back to all of that. But yeah, I mean, I've heard about artists that they can't explain what they're doing while they're doing it. They can only when they stop. So same thing. So
same idea.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess, it would go to how because you could probably depend, well, we spoke about when I'm defining concepts on my level, not the level of a scientist, I will have one definition. And so, for example, for me, I would make the distinction between understanding and I think you use the concept mastery or skill.
Mastery.
We'll just go mastery or skill or something like that. And so I use that as a distinguishing concept. And so then if you're telling me full understanding includes both of those, we'd need to, like in then having a conversation about this, it's like a process of bridging contexts of like, I think about it differently. But yeah, that makes sense that there's an important component of the application of knowledge, which is separate from, say, being able to define it.
Yeah.
Being able to define it is just mentally holding the thing you're thinking about and being able to identify it, and then looking for those, because you can identify it, you can make distinctions between its different characteristics and identify that which is most important and then put that in the definition. So It would mean you have it in memory and you have it in, and you identify what the concept is, right? That's it. But that
it helps you identify and organize your concepts by their essentials. But I mean, certainly it includes so much more, and at least with us sense of concepts, that the ones you see like milk or just say apple, you don't need to define it to understand it.
Yeah.
In a way, defining it would be difficult. It's more descriptive than anything. You're just describing an apple when you define it usually. But defining fruit, you could do that easily. But you don't see fruit in itself. You see instances of fruits like apples, but you don't see fruit. And that way you can define fruit. Sure, no problem.
Yeah. And then when it comes to usually on those concepts, we don't have issues, but with piety, for example, which is where that then piety and everything else.
Definition plays an even bigger role there because it's so abstract, so far from perception that you need something to make it small enough that you can deal with it, that you can handle it in your head without getting overwhelmed by details.
Yeah. What I'm still, for me, it's I see on some level that how valuable it could be if you held the most essential or fundamental characteristic of the thing in mind when you think of it, because it's simply a better, more efficient trigger for memory. That's my understanding of it. Like if I think of human as rational animal, then and I've got a clear, vivid conceptualization of rational as well, then when I think of when I see a sentence that includes man in it or human, then the first thing that occurs to me is rational, and that brings up all the relevant associations. And because the connections are logical, like rational is, like everything is logically connected in a hierarchy. Like rational would explains poetry, explains buildings, explains toothbrushes, whatever. The process of memorization and holding the units in mind is more efficient. That seems to be my understanding of it so far, not yet proven because I want to test it on myself. But is that how you see it? Definition is simply almost like a memory enhancer. That's it.
Yes, that's how I see it.
Yeah.
It could even help subconscious thinking. I mean, it helps with that. Helps you recall things and notice things.
Yeah.
But it even helps your creative thinking. I think that by thinking about it, then you activate all these other concepts and you might not even be directly aware of it. And that helps your thinking as well. It helps your creative thinking, creative thought.
Yes.
Come at problem solving even.
I can see that too.
About that I've been reading a lot about that lately. So I've been thinking about like the creative process, not just like doing art, but I mean like problem solving, figuring out puzzles, like insight when you discover like out of nowhere, like that something's true, or something clicks. That feeling of insight is what I've been reading about. Like when everything just clicks all of a sudden.
You're writing something down. What have you? That was also there was some of that in the Think as if your life depends on it about creativity. There was quite a bit of that Brandon wrote about, quoting a few other books on creativity, and she made a claim that, well, from the books she quoted, she said that she said that the subconscious isn't actively calculating or running something, but what happens is when someone's thought about a problem a lot and built up all these connections in their mind, there'll be one little thing that falls into place after all the previous thought, which then triggers the final integration. She's explained it that way.
Yes, I would agree with that.
What have you, and so you're reading, you said you're reading about creativity. Was that primarily what you're reading about, creativity?
Yeah, the past few days.
Okay.
Like intuitions like that. Like where does this come from? That moment of integration, to use objectivist terms.
Right.
Who wrote that book you're talking about?
Well, it's a series of lectures transcribed from Barbara Brandon, and it was Think as if your life depends on it. I think it was by Nathaniel Brandon, but
I should look into that.
Yeah, there's a whole section there on creativity, and she's trying to relate it to the other parts in the book as well.
I had read a book about it. That's why. And it's
Yeah,
related
okay.
to the research I want to do, because I was reading it because one of the professors I'm interviewing with studies this thing specifically insight. And when the subconscious discovers something, he uses
Oh,
the word
wow.
unconscious, but he means the same thing as
Yeah,
subconscious.
yeah.
And we use
Yeah.
that. But yeah,
Yeah,
it's the
okay.
same sort of thing that you let it marinate. I like to say the term, you let the ideas marinate. You just let them
Oh,
sit for a while. And then eventually they congeal and they integrate into something at the end out of nowhere.
well, that I would say um, the risk in that is it could be a rationalization for, oh, I just need to
Right.
take a break and let the idea marinate so it sorts itself
I've
out.
I've
Whereas
done that before. I've done that.
it's not backed. It's not necessarily true. It may be that you need to commit as hard as you can until you're exhausted, and then you just take a holiday,
Yeah, you
and
need to
then you
be
come
honest
back.
with yourself, really, when you do that for sure. Like, when you either stuck or you just don't want to work.
Yeah,
If you're truly stuck, like an artist knows, like writer's block is a thing. Like, you get so stuck, like nothing happens. You know you're
yeah,
stuck, but it is
yeah.
easy to fall into a trap. I just don't want to do it right now.
So going back to our conversation about concepts and creativity, you're saying that so one of the other benefits are the hierarchical connections and causal connections, not only in the thing that the concept itself is referring to, but how it relates to other things. And so when you have that automated in the back of your mind, you're looking at the world in terms that are we could say more causal. I don't know how to explain this versus a random association. So, for example, if I associate man and poetry, like how much am I going to notice versus if the first thing I hold in mind is man and rationality in terms of my observations of other people and
Yeah,
connections I'm going to make between other subjects and fields.
yeah,
Is that what you're saying?
yeah. Very similar to that. I mean, there are weird connections sometimes your brain has, but overall, yes, you by organizing explicitly beforehand, you make it so the connections between concepts are clear in your mind, even connected subconsciously, that the connections are so strong that connections are being used even when you're not thinking about them directly. Like, you're strengthening the connections that much. You're making it part of not just your thinking, but like the way your consciousness works, even. You're
Yeah.
embedding it in your consciousness, your subconsciousness, so it just pops out when you need. And other associations you might make that might be random, might be causal. Sometimes there would be weird associations, like you might organize things really well, but then you might have some connection between, say, what image you use to define a concept. Like, if, say, certainty, you think of Peacock's train hitting you, then you might have an association with the train when you say certainty, and those concepts might be connected even just loosely because of that image you assign to it. So you can have a
Right.
vast web of things that are logically connected, but also some weird connections just established by the image of things, the metaphor, if you will.
Well, to me, I would say that you could have what you describe as a weird or random image, which I would say is just a chance emotional association versus
Yes,
a logical association, so
right.
meaning causal, and not only a logical association that is abstract, but one that is concrete. So, for example, when I think of certainty, I won't necessarily think of the train, but when I think of concretizing abstraction, I will have an image of a train hitting me or me having a breakdown or something really vivid and powerful, but it also logically relevant. So I don't know about
Yeah,
the random images that occur to me. From what I understand so far, that it's not like you can get rid of them, but you want to go
right.
more towards the logical with imagery and
Yeah,
vivid. What do you
I
think of
think you're
that?
right. Yeah, I think you're right. I don't know what to say about what the right images are, but I think that's the right idea. And they don't need to be random as
Yeah,
much as they're different standard for their connection, a
right.
different way to think about them within
Yeah,
that
okay.
vast web of ideas. And the hierarchy is there. and that what keeps it grounded.
Yeah. I, I can see already some benefit in having put in some effort to clarify concepts, because for some it becomes clear that I don't understand them, and for others that I did clarify and I had the knowledge already had in mind, like I could mentally recall what the thing refers to because I use it frequently enough. Rearranging the knowledge has been helpful, which is, so I can see that already. And I am curious. It's really hard to know how significant the impact would be if you managed to do that with almost all your concepts. Not that that would make sense because there's too many, but with, let's say, all the significant ones, and if you held them in a very, and if the connections between them were extremely clear, what the benefit would be. Like, just thinking of that gets me excited, because it's really hard to relate it. I think I can think of them individually and I can go, okay, understanding refers to when this and this occurs. And there are some, like, just off the top of my head, some associations I have, there are some related concepts, like, let's say, context, knowledge, what else is there? Anyway, let's go with that. Context, knowledge, concepts. And so you've got some related associations, but it's still not, there's not like like clear hierarchy in your mind. And even if you did have a clear hierarchy, it would necessarily be individual in that if you're not a scientist or, a researcher, that you're going to have your own, you might even be using words that other people don't use.
Yeah.
But I think that's to me is the most interesting, is what happens once you have really clear connections between them. And that's where I'm currently stuck, I think, because it's hard to, it's very hard to make clear logical connections between the other concepts.
It is. I mean, I would wonder what it brings to someone. I guess I would wonder about, say, the most eminent people in whatever field. Let's just say music. Imagine Beethoven. In what way were concepts clear to him? In what way was thinking about music clear to him?
Yeah.
Things like that. I don't know. I'd be curious to explore that. But that's kind of one reason I read biographies sometimes. Like, I wonder about what clarity of concepts do they have? Where do they get their understanding of the world? Is it just some gift they had, or was it really actually a lot of thinking involved? I think people take for granted how much people have to develop their thinking to function well. Even if you're doing something physical, there's much more mental work than people might realize.
I think you're right. I was thinking about that a lot recently, because seeing that, first of all, you don't need a theory of concept formation. All you need is someone who's going through a rigorous process of questioning and observation as well, like intense observation, and then trying to relate the thing he's observed to other things he's observed. And that's all you need. Obviously, it would help if you had a complete philosophical theory, but there's something relevant. I was just looking for that, which is, I was reading the biography of, who was it that I was reading? Da Vinci.
Yeah.
And so he does speak a lot about, he describes initially in his early period in his life, he describes himself as a disciple of experience and experiment. He didn't have a formal education, so he would just draw everything he observed and ask questions as random as, like, what does the beak of this bird look like? Ask a friend how this beak works. Here, and he says here, there's a quote, he who has access to the fountain does not go to the water jar. Initially, when he started, he would make fun of those who were academics, because he was like, the fountain is going out into the world and observing and taking notes and drawing pictures of things and doing experiments. And I think that was interesting to me, because I think that's, I have a tendency probably towards going more to the water jar than the fountain. Anyway, so there's a lot in his biography where he speaks about, and then later on he evolves. So he's like, those who are in love with practice without theoretical knowledge are the sailor who goes into a ship without a rudder or compass, and who never and can never be certain where they are going.
Yeah.
Practice must always be founded on sound theory. Anyway, I thought that was interesting and relevant. The other thing is, in terms of Mozart, I've been thinking about this too, but I have a tendency to use primarily my visual senses. So my visual, just sight, but we have 5 other senses. So shouldn't we also be able to be able to form concepts on the basis of other senses? For example, Mozart forming concepts on the basis of combinations of sounds.
Probably. I mean, I'm sure that's a crucial distinction. Yeah, you can't understand in visual terms. Like, if you want to be a good musician, you've got to engage with sound first and foremost. You can't, I mean, you could do other ways, but I think which sense to engage with, I guess, depends on, one, the acuity of that sense of yours, and 2, just what you're trying to learn. Like, if you want to understand music theory, I don't think you could avoid just develop your concepts from all sound perception. I don't think you could use much visual at all.
But if we're applying over this process of forming concepts by identifying the phenomena or the thing that it refers to, and then storing it in terms of fundamentals, if you try and transfer that over to music, for example, it may mean that in listening to sound, you identify some fundamental combination and you use that as the basis for the concept, which it's like a different, it's easy when you think about things visually, but I imagine that it probably transfers to other senses as well. Or for example, it might mean you form a concept on the basis of a sound, but also sensation, or a combination of sensation in your body when you move a certain way or play something a certain way. Okay, now you have to change and behave this way. And you're also in a way forming a concept on some kind of identification of perception, but you're just using different sensations.
Yeah, I think it really just affects how you validate the concept, I think.
Yeah.
Like, I would say mathematical concepts help musical concepts, because that's a lot to do with patterns. I know those affect perhaps some, I'm not sure what else. It's not like the only understanding of a concept has to be one sense modality. I think you could have multiple, but you need at least one to ground it in reality.
Right. Okay.
I'm not sure I'm answering your question though.
I don't even know if I really had a question. I guess it was just the observation that maybe you could, like if we just rely on visual sensation is one sense organ, but we have others. And so what would stop us from integrating all of them in the process of forming concepts?
Nothing's stopping you from doing that. I think that would actually enhance thinking or understanding sometimes. It's more like adding on to your understanding of the concept already. Like, if you can add sound information, that's even better.
Yeah.
Like, if you want to understand the concept of a particular bird, or understand, say, corvids, that type of bird, you might want to integrate the sound they make into your understanding of what it is, the cry they have.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess the difficulty then is just there's benefits, but then there's the question of logical relationship, because you gave the link. Remember, you sent me the link about this Russian guy who Shamanovsky, I forgot what he's called. Do you remember who, after we read Borges' story?
I think
you sent me a link to some Russian guy who had an amazing memory.
Oh yeah, Luria. He studied a guy. One of his patients could remember just about everything.
What was his name again?
I don't remember his name, but the Russian guy was Luria, Luria.
Shereshevsky. Solomon Shereshevsky.
Yes.
Yeah, so in the case of Shereshevsky, he gave an example of he went to go buy an ice cream and the woman told him what the flavor was, and it was like black coals just came out of her mouth and they were all in his face, and so he didn't want to eat the ice cream anymore. And so in that case, there's no logical, like maybe you'll remember the flavor, but there's not necessarily a logical relationship between them. Whereas take, for example, someone like, I think he's called Jacob Barnett. He went to study physics at university at like age 14 or something. And he developed his own number system using like, or each number had like a different shape, and it was like a triangle. He broke it down by primes. And so there was actually a logical basis for this visualization that he had of like, 53 would be like a triangle with these things around it. And then he could very easily manipulate numbers. And so that's an example of someone who is has made use of like combining other senses and not just relying on one to form concepts, but doing so while still retaining the logical causal relationships.
Yeah, I think the problem with Luria's patient, Shereshevsky or whatever is that he was lacking the ability to abstract for some reason. It's probably a form of autism, given what I know about autism, that there's actually a problem underlying it. Not so much that being too concrete was a problem, but he couldn't be anything other than concrete.
Right.
And he could remember things because he didn't have abstractions really.
Right.
All his memory was devoted to concrete things.
Right.
He had no need to remember abstractions because he barely could hold them in his head anyway.
Although, how is he a journalist then? Like, that doesn't...
Wait, maybe you're thinking of a different person?
I'm thinking of Shereshevsky. That was his name. Solomon Shereshevsky. So he was also known as Luria S, and mnemonist, active in the 1920s. He was subject of Alexander Luria's case study, The Mind of a Mnemonist.
Yeah.
Yeah. He just had an active imagination, but which helped him generate useful mnemonics.
Oh,
he claimed, maybe someone else.
Okay, let me look up this person. Exactly, I'm probably thinking of someone else. I looked up. Luria wrote about him, and who? Let's see. Mind of a Mnemonist. Where is it? Let's see. Looking at this. Let's see. Yeah, I don't remember the details of that guy too much. He had synesthesia.
Okay.
And that was a big part of it. That synesthesia helped his memory. So I don't know about the rest of the stuff, but the synesthesia is really what helped his memory.
Right.
That his memory was enhanced by that sense perception. And the more grounded in sense perception, the easier it is to recall things. But you're right, if it's not grounded with a logical order, it wouldn't be well put together. It would be almost like random associations.
Right.
It needs a logical order to have use in the end.
Well, even the logical order is the consequence of the fact that, like, so if for example, if I perceive a word and it has a color, even though it doesn't, then I'm not actually seeing reality. So the connection isn't logical by definition. It's my mind's creation.
Yeah.
And so that I could see how that would help memory, but it wouldn't help conceptualization.
Yeah, it might not necessarily, because that's to be a voluntary process to even do that.
How I got some more questions for you. How have you found? So one thing I'm interested in is obviously these hierarchical, not only hierarchical connections, but the connections between different concepts. How have you found, given that it feels like when I've gone to clarify my concepts, it's more like a flat structure, meaning there's all these different concepts and you just go up one level and then you go to entity and that's it. But there's no like big tree of concepts that goes all the way up. And also the relationships, there's many like relationships between others that are not like right above it, if you know what I'm saying. It's what would be an example? Yeah, I mean, take relationship, for example. Relationship being a kind of cause, identification of a cause and effect, um, causes and effects of different entities, causes of different entities affecting other entities, something like that. Like, where do you go from there? You know, like you go one level up and you're at identification and you're done. Um, it's hard to have you found relating, have you found the process of trying to integrate as many concepts as possible so you've got access to them when you think of the thing?
Um, in my mind, I usually go about clarifying the concepts, reorganizing them, or changing a premise. And I guess the other thing is knowing relationships. Um, I usually organize them just based on at least one area at a time. Like I'm not imagining like a huge web at a time. Like I at most maybe there's a handful of concepts, let's say 5 to 10 that I could really go to quickly. I might
Yeah.
not see them all at once, but like I'm just dealing with a small set of information. And then once I think about that, I might follow the connections as I go. I can know that there's broadly speaking things above more abstract and things below more concrete. And I think of things that way, and I could have a general sense of where I could be going. Almost like I don't have the directions, but relative to where I am now, I know how to get to any place in my mind. It might take some time to get there, but
What's the North
I know the
Star
general
then that
direction.
you're using?
The North Star, my North Star when I navigate my concepts. I would say, metaphorically speaking, the goal I've set beforehand in my mind.
Okay.
That's where I can get back to where I was based on what goal I had set. And I can know where I'm going based on the goal I set.
Okay.
Otherwise, I get lost.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Cool.
So it's not necessarily a clean process, but